So we're going to talk today about something that I know a lot about. I've been doing a lot of studying over the course of the last couple of months, and we're going to talk about some of the things that I've been studying. Is anyone familiar with the concept of TULIP and the 5 points of Calvinism? So in the 5 points of Calvinism, we have sovereignty, which is the acceptance that God is 100% and totally, completely sovereign. We have total depravity, which means that we are completely and totally depraved and unable to come to God on our own. Unconditional election is the fact that God chooses us. Limited atonement means that there's only a limited number of people that receive Christ's atonement. Irresistible grace means that if God has chosen us, that we have no choice, we will end up coming to God. And perseverance of the saints is the whole idea of once saved, always saved. So this is not something that I know a lot about. So we are not going to be talking about this. Because I know a little bit about that, but not enough to explain to anybody else. Would somebody look up Psalm 82 for me? By the way, this is the book that I'm reading about this. It's 1,100 pages long. And when I get it done, maybe I'll understand enough to teach a sermon on it. Anyway, Psalm 82, verse 1. Go ahead.
All right, God presides in the divine assembly. He renders judgment among the gods.
Okay. So there's two words in there where it says God and then gods. Those words in the ancient Hebrew are the same word, which means that God presides over a council of other gods. I also don't know enough about this to talk about that today, but it is something that I'm reading and studying about. So,
I haven't read it, but
and this is the book that I'm reading about the supernatural, which if you ever are interested in, it will blow your mind. So, I also know a little bit about the gym. I've spoken about lessons I've learned in the gym before, right? There's really powerful lessons you can learn from going to the gym. I'm also not going to talk about that today. I also have talked about the 12 steps, which I know a lot about, but we're not talking about that either. I'm also not going to talk about health or chiropractic. These are all things that I know a lot about. I'm going to talk about the one thing that I probably know more about than anything else and anyone else in this room. I'm going to talk about community. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my history with community and some ideas about community. And then in the follow-up sermon next week, we're going to talk about some very specific applications of what that looks like. So I moved from Phoenix metropolitan area, 3.5 million people in 1991 to a little area that had a population of a metropolitan area of 3,500 people. My parents moved there to be a part of an intentional community. But the story actually starts way before that. In the mid-1970s, 1974, 1975, my parents moved from Virginia to a little town outside of Eugene, Oregon called Dexter. My parents grew up in a Lutheran. They were both Lutheran. They didn't grow up in the same Lutheran church, but they both grew up in the Lutheran church. In the early 1970s, they got saved into Calvary Chapel. And I don't know if you know anything about Calvary Chapel. Calvary Chapel was very charismatic, very rapture-oriented. So my parents got saved into Calvary Chapel, and they moved from Virginia to Oregon, this little intentional community. And this intentional community was called Shiloh. It's still there. It's not called the same thing anymore, but it's still there. And they moved there, and my dad was the doctor for the community. His entire support structure came from the community. They used it. The way it worked is that there was the Jesus People movement. So these people would get radically saved on the streets of San Francisco. These street people and hippies and these bums would get saved, and they would get shipped off to this intentional community outside of Eugene in a town called Dexter. And it was a whole community. They learned how to work. They learned discipleship. They learned life skills. And like everyone who was there was supported by the community. One of the things they used to do in order to raise money was called chicken picking. My mom did this when she was pregnant with me and my brother, which probably explains a little bit. But what they used to do is because chickens, when they're at night, like they become like almost comatose. And so like these big chicken farms would hire these people from the community, and each person would go in and they'd turn on these special lights that didn't disturb the chickens. And so every person would go in there and they would grab 3 chicken legs, grab 3 chickens in each hand. And they would run in there and they would grab a total of 6 chickens and they'd run out and they'd put them in cages. And they would do that all night long to take the chickens to the butcher. So my mom did that when she was several months pregnant. And that's how my mom earned enough money to buy us our first pony. And we had that pony from 1976 to 1991. Every single one of us in the family learned how to ride on that pony, and she died shortly after we moved to Washington. Why do I tell you all about this? The concept of community is an addicting thing if you've ever been a part of it. It really is an addicting. Most people don't even have any concept of what community looks like. This was an entire compound that was dedicated to the idea of community. And in 1978, that community, as oftentimes communities do, imploded. And my parents followed one of the pastors that was a part of that and several other families down to Phoenix, Arizona. So I was like 2 years old. My brother and I were 2 years old. And so that's how then I ended up growing up in Arizona until 1991. Now, growing up, my dad was very staunchly pro-life, right? It's important to the story. So my dad was staunchly pro-life. I saw my dad get arrested multiple times for protesting outside of abortion clinics. And he used to travel around to pro-life rallies to give speeches. And it was at one of these conferences, he decided to take my brother to this conference. And my dad was giving a speech, and my brother went to go hear this other speech by this couple named Barry and Ann Bird. And it was about community. And so my brother goes back and he starts telling my dad about this community, this speech that he heard about, this presentation. And my dad got super excited about it because he had been a part of community. And now he's hearing about it again. So he goes and he meets the people that gave the presentation and he signs up for their mailing list. He starts to get information, and he and my mom start to get this information from this community that they're getting ready to start. And they just are getting more and more excited because this is something that they had been a part of for multiple years of their life. They had devoted their lives to the idea of community. And so they heard about it. Marble Community Fellowship up there, it was a 500-acre piece of land that a group of investors bought in order to start an intentional community. It had been an apple orchard back around 1900, one of the largest apple orchards in all of Washington. 1,500 acres was how big it was then. So they bought 500 acres of it and they subdivided it into parcels. And so my parents got all excited about it. And so my parents told us that, hey, we're going to drive up and we're going to go hang out at Christmas in the snow. My parents presented it as this cool thing to go, like, because we grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. We don't get snow. So the idea of getting to go spend Christmas in the snow was kind of fun. And they're like, oh yeah, and by the way, we might think about potentially, possibly, maybe moving there. Like, my brother and I gave each other this look like, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. So we drove up there and we spent Christmas and New Year's, and we met all these really crazy people. They were literally, like, I had no concept of what these people were all about. We met in this old, almost what looked like an abandoned schoolhouse in the basement of an old abandoned schoolhouse. So it wasn't even the schoolhouse part. It was the basement. Cold, damp. And they sang like bluegrass music and they preached all these weird sermons. And then they had an adults only meeting and they kicked all the kids outside in the snow. And here I am running around with all these people. I'm 15 years old and don't know any of these people. And we're out there for hours while the adults are having an adults only meeting, which my parents were part of the conversation because they're trying to recruit my parents to come up there. Didn't know that at the time. So my brother and I are still just like, I mean, we're having a good time, but we're not really going to do this. And then New Year's Eve comes around. We're still up there on New Year's Eve. And there's this all night meeting that happens. And everyone in the church is getting up and confessing their sins. Everyone is getting up and just spilling their guts. And we're just like, what on earth is this that's going on here? Again, I don't know how many times my brother and I just did the subtle, we're looking at each other in the eye like, this is nuts. We never actually said it out loud. We have this whole experience while we're up there, and then we drive back. And the whole time we're just like, that's not going to happen. My parents aren't really saying anything to us about it. We get back a couple of weeks later. They're like, guess what? We're moving to Washington this summer. I was not happy. I had just finished my freshman year of high school. I was on the honor roll. I was part of the youth group. I was on the football team, the track team, drama club. All my friends were there. I was about to get my driver's license. Anything and everything I knew was in Arizona. And as much as I didn't like it being 110 degrees, I really wasn't looking forward to it being minus 10 degrees. And so we packed up that summer and we drove up there. My brother and I just kept looking at each other like, wait, is this actually really happening? We got there in June of 1992 and wasn't real happy, but it was like this whole thing with community. I've said a lot of things about that place that maybe don't seem as flattering, but if you take some of that stuff out, it was a great place to grow up. We used to have some of the craziest, wildest fun in this community. It's midnight on a Saturday and it's a full moon and it just snowed. Hey guys, let's all go grab our sleds and the 4-wheel drive pickup truck and drive up and down the highway on sleds in the full moon. Like, it almost sounds, in some ways, there were a lot of things about it that were just too good to be true. Right now, I'm talking about all the good in the community. And that's where I learned how to dance. We used to have dances like twice a month. And that's where I learned how to swing dance, waltz, foxtrot. They were country dances. And I'm not going to lie, I showed up in a brown leisure suit and a tie-dye t-shirt and platform shoes. My brother had a green leisure suit and I had a brown leisure suit and platform shoes. Over time, we kind of incorporated into the mix. I actually wore Wrangler jeans and cowboy boots and a cowboy hat fairly regularly for a couple of years. I know you can't imagine it now, but I did the cowboy thing for a little while. My brother and I used to DJ those country dances. That community was really close though. Every Sunday, church went from about 9 o'clock in the morning, and we often didn't go home until 9 o'clock at night. Sunday school at 9, church from 10 to 12, potluck until about 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then we would go do work projects on the community until dark. Then we'd flip on the floodlights and play volleyball until we could barely stand up anymore. So oftentimes, we would get there. And if you were on the sound team, like my brother and I were, we were often there at 8 o'clock in the morning and not home until 8, 9 o'clock at night. So we spent a lot of time with those people. We could either hate them or we could learn to tolerate them and actually get along with them. And so we eventually it was good times, very good times. We used to chase each other around in cars on the property in the middle of the night with the lights, turn the lights off until you're like right behind somebody and then you flip them on. Yeah. We used to get phone calls. What are you guys doing? This was before cell phones. So they would call my parents. My parents would come looking for us. We'd be driving all over the property. Lots of fun, but we worked together. We literally blood, sweat, and tears together in that community. So the community was on a water system. The source of it was like half a mile or a mile away. So there was a break in that water system. And so no one in the community had water. And we literally spent all night, one guy with a backhoe, digging up a mile of water pipe with everyone else out there with picks and shovels, literally all night long. And I think it was November. So it was cold. But it's one of those things that you never forget, and it will bring you together like nothing else. So the way the water system worked is it fed into this cistern that was made out of logs. And so logs aren't exactly mud and waterproof. So at one point, all the water coming down through the pipe into the cistern on the property, became undrinkable because it was full of mud. So we had to go up there, and this was like in December, and there was snow on the ground. We literally stripped down to our skivvies and jumped into this cistern that was about 3 feet deep, full of mud. And we would go in shifts with shovels. We got 2 guys in there at a time and shovel mud out until you couldn't feel your feet anymore. And then 2 more guys would jump in, and 2 guys would go jump in the truck, warm up a little bit. And about every 3 to 5 minutes, we were out there shoveling, mucking out this cistern because the community didn't have water. And that's what we did. We used to put on this giant 4th of July celebration every year. This little community of people. And we would have 1,800 to 2,000 people show up. And it was all just this small group of people would have all this big, huge event. I've got 1,000 stories that I could tell about that community. One time we were doing this cowboy show. Like, we're reading cowboy poetry and doing this whole thing. And so all the guys are like, we're walking around and we're in cowboy boots and we're all strapped, and we're like, we got done putting the show on. We're all jacked up. So we're all excited and we don't want to go to bed. So we walked down on the property. If you go down the back side, there's a road that leads down to the Columbia River. And so we all went down and hiked about halfway down this road and just pulled out our guns and just started terrorizing the night sky. Like, we were just, anything and everything you could shoot, we were shooting it off. And then we see this pickup truck light start coming down the road. We all jump up on the side of the hill and we just lay flat in the bushes. About 8 of us. And there's one guy, he's the best BSer of the group. Like, he's literally from Texas Cowboy. His name's Trent. Jared knows who he is. We appointed him to stand out on the road to meet whoever this was that was coming down the road. And we're all literally like, and it's probably from me to you, and we're just laying flat on this hill, being absolutely dead quiet. And this guy drives up. It was Eric Johnston. Drives up, who's a wild and crazy guy anyway, member of the community. He comes down there and he's like, what's going on down here? And Trent, being Trent, I don't know. I heard a bunch of gunshots going off and I decided to come check it out and see what was going on. And Eric's like, you sure? Because I could hear it all the way over at my house. There had to be a whole bunch of them. I have no idea. And Eric is a hothead. I could tell you stories about Eric Johnston. Total hothead. Anyway, and Trent just like does the good old boy Southern drawl charm. And he's like, I don't know. And he eventually talks Eric to just drive away. And we're literally like laying in the grass, like 6 feet away from this pickup truck. And we're trying not to laugh and also trying not to like wet our pants at the same time. Not that we necessarily would have gotten in trouble, but you always just think that you're going to get in trouble, especially in that community where you could get in trouble for a lot of things that didn't seem like you should. The power of community. So I grew up, the first 15 years of my life, I didn't have that. The next about 15 years of my life, I did have that. And those are times that I will never forget. And the reason I'm talking about all this stuff about community is because it's very, very powerful. You guys have experienced it on some level with some of the things that you guys have done. And when you live in a community, it's a whole nother level. It really is. It becomes this great shared experience. Like very few people talk about. It was so powerful to my parents that they experienced it for about 3 years in the middle of the 70s. And then 15 years later, all they had to do was hear about it and they wanted it again. And we pulled up roots and moved halfway across the country to a completely and totally new and unique and different place than any of us could possibly imagine. And community is something that, like, You can tell I'm very passionate about community. I was literally going to talk about one of these other things. And then I started to think about community, and I was like, I need to talk about my experience with community. And so this week I'm laying the foundation for some things. And then next week I'm going to go into a little bit more of some specific application of how we can apply community principles even in the city. This country it's starving for community. I just looked it up before I came up here. About a quarter of the population of the United States of America lives in the 10 largest metropolitan areas. About 80 million people live in the 10 highest metropolitan areas in the United States. And the population of America is about 330 million people. So it's almost 25% live in 10 cities. And there's no sense of community. And you pull up those maps that say that are like blue and red, the demographics for their politics. And it's like this huge, like 90% plus red. And then these little pockets of blue. Well, you know what that 90% of red is? That 90% is community, right? Those people are in communities. Those 80 million people that live in those big cities, there's no sense of community in those places. Everyone's doing their own thing. Everyone's just following the news media or following social media. It's a collective. It's not a community. Those people in those red areas, that's community. Those little small towns. And if you want to talk about growing up in a small town, if anyone grew up in a town smaller than 350, then you lived in a small town. Yakima's not a small town. It feels like a small town, but it's not a small town. But you can build a sense of community inside of a major city. I felt that sense of community early on when I moved here, because it's not necessarily about it. Community isn't necessarily a geographic area. It is an idea. And you guys have experienced that through the banquet and balls and the small groups that you've done. And Jared's adopting of the principle of the inner ring. That's what the inner ring is. The inner ring is like this deep sense of community. And when you do stuff like that together, you build a connection with those people in those groups. Like nothing else builds that other than doing things together. That community. Like there's still a part of me, and I haven't lived at Marble in 20 years. And I still go back there and I still feel that. And I can still literally drive through that community and be like, oh, I poured that foundation. I built that roof. Oh, that's where I fell and broke my back. You know, that's where David Fitzgerald proposed to Sadie. That's where all the guys used to pee off the balcony when we lived in the dorm. So I'll tell you a story about that. So like when we were part of our discipleship school up there, all the guys lived upstairs in this old bunkhouse that we had converted into sleeping quarters. There was no bathroom in there. So we had to go down the stairs and around the building and across the street to a bunkhouse to go to the bathroom. Well, no one wants to do that in the middle of the night. And there was this little balcony where the stairs were connected. And we would just walk out there. We're out in the country. We just relieve ourselves off the porch. And innocently one day in the summertime, I heard this lady go, why is the grass all dead right under the stairs? Because there was this huge patch of yellow dead grass right underneath the balcony. I just turned around and didn't say a word. But I knew exactly what that was from. My brother my brother didn't fall off the stairs. The stairs fell out from underneath him. Whoever had built the stairs didn't build them well. And the stairs collapsed. And my brother, God bless him, 25 years later, still has residual pain from when that set of stairs fell.
There's nothing to do with you guys weakening the foundation.
No, probably not. Probably not. But it was in that community where the banquet and ball was born. Because when we first moved up there, they had just literally done a banquet and ball that last winter. And then we moved up there 6 months later and everyone was still talking about it. Like stories from that first one that they did, like echoed for years. And then several years later, they're like, hey, guess what? We're going to do that again. And so we did it again. And it became a tradition again. And that's where Jared experienced it. And it was birthed out of that community where that came from. like I said, I could tell story after story, but you guys have a sense of community too. I've been around you guys enough that I get jealous because I sit there and all you guys will be telling stories back and forth, and I'm like, man, that sounds like some of the stuff that I used to do when I was a teenager. And you guys have that sense of community. It's different, but it's still there. We did it like we're literally living next to each other, and you guys did plenty of crazy stuff. So if you guys went back there and were hanging out with me and you were here hearing me tell all the stories, and I was there at Christmas and we were all sitting around, me and my buddy David Fitzgerald and my brother-in-law, we were sitting there. It was like the day after Christmas and we just went off on like this 2-hour story tangent that was just like, we were just cracking up. And some of the other people that were there, they're looking at us like, what kind of childhood? What in the world? You know, the same way I get when I'm hanging around sometimes with you guys. And I'm like, I can relate, but not specifically, but I've done things like that. It's pretty cool what you guys have built in a different way. It's still community, but it's a different way. When they asked me to be an elder and asked me to like speak every once in a while, they said I have to bring some scripture in sometimes. So we're going to bring some scripture into this whole idea. So first of all, the entire Bible is about community. The entire Bible is groups of people getting together and doing either really cool or really terrible stuff together most of the time. The entire Old Testament is about the community of the nation of Israel. And I'm reading through the Old Testament. I'm doing a Bible in a year plan right now. And so I'm rereading the Old Testament for the first time in several years. And I don't get to skip all the little boring stuff. So I'm reading all of it. And there's so many little laws and so many little crazy things in there that I'm just like, what is this all about? And it's all about how to live in community. There's literally scripture that was like, if you borrow a tool from your friend and it breaks, you have to fix it. If you rent a tool from your neighbor and it breaks, then he has to fix it. You know, and it's like just these very, very specific laws of things like if you touch a dead animal, you have to separate yourself. And if you have to offer all these sacrifices and do all these things. And it's very specific. And as I'm reading it, two things really struck me. One is all of those sacrifices and all of that stuff was done away with by Christ. And so that's one of the things. The other thing that's been striking me is this idea of community through all of it, because this is all stuff that if you follow this, that's the way you continue to get along. That's the way that you continue to operate and function as a community. And some of it seems crazy and some of it seems weird. Like cut off the dove's leg and wave it in the air and then sprinkle the blood on I'm like, I know it all means something. And someday I'm going to have someone tell me what that all means. But for now, I'm just like, God very specifically tells them how to do this. And you were supposed to hold your neighbor accountable. You were supposed to do all these things in order to try to live together. It wasn't some random thing. If you actually look at it and read through it, it's like, if you do these things, you guys are going to get along. Like if you accidentally kill somebody, go to the city of refuge, wait for your trial, and no one can kill you. But if someone catches you before you get to the city of refuge, could someone pull up Micah 4 and another person pull up Acts 2:42? So whoever pulls up Micah 4, read Micah 4, 1 through 5.
Got it. ESV or NLT?
ESV is fine.
It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. And it shall be lifted up above the hills, and the people shall flow to it. And many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and shall decide disputes for strong nations as far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. A nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. But they shall sit, every man under his vine, and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. For all the peoples walk, each in the name of his God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever.
Okay. So that was a scripture that we used to read probably once or twice a month when I growing up at Marble. And they used to preach that scripture that they were building a city on a hill and that other people would come to them to learn from them and follow their ways. Well, the community that we were in, we all loved each other. The community outside of who we were didn't always like us so much. So they would preach this idea of building a city on a hill, that people will come to us and ask us how to do this thing. But we weren't very good at communicating that message to other people. So no one ever really came to us to have us teach them of our God and his ways. And I just think that I wanted to use that scripture to compare and contrast. Like, that scripture was preached over and over and over again in our community growing up, and it didn't really end up having a lot of practical application. Here, I know Jared heard that scripture lots of times up there, and he and I have had this conversation multiple times. And he literally just got approached by people in the Republican Party in politics in this state because they see what's being done here, and they want what is being done here. So in a very large sense, like, this community is living out that Micah 4 in a way that that community never did. Acts 2:42 through 47.
They were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone kept feeling a sense of awe, and many wonders and signs were taking place through the apostles. And all those who had believed were together and had all things in common. And they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all, as any might have need. Day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart, praising God for having favor with all the people. And the Lord was adding to their number day by day those who were being saved.
It's a pretty good description of what can happen in community. I'm not a socialist. A lot of people use that scripture to justify socialism, that they all had all things in common. That's not what I'm using that verse for. The point of that verse that I want to bring across is that they lived in community and they helped each other. And between all of them, not only did they help themselves, help each other, they helped the greater community. And because of that help, people were being added to their number every day. Community. I want to talk about one term, which is ecclesia. So ecclesia is actually an old Greek term. The church uses it a lot. It's actually mentioned 115 different times in the New Testament, ecclesia. But before it was used in the Bible, it was a Greek term for people who were summoned together to work together for a common cause. And so we used to talk about the concept of ecclesia up at Marble all the time. We called out community of God. We used it in a term where we were trying to separate us. We were trying to build that city on a hill, but our city on a hill was not anywhere where anyone could see it. City on a hill is supposed to shine the light out so that other people can see it, but we were kind of inbred, to use a southern term. It's not a southern term, but you get what I mean. We were kind of inbred. But the concept of ecclesia is much bigger than that. It's the called out community. We're supposed to come together as a group of people with a common purpose to shine a light, to deliver a message, to make a difference to other people. Could someone pull up Matthew 16:18? This is kind of like the quintessential verse that people quote when they're talking about ecclesia. I want to read that and talk about it for just a minute, and then a couple other things about community. And then next week, I'm going to dig into a little bit of some practical stuff.
ESV. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.
And in that situation, church is ecclesia, is the called out community. Community is addicting. Once you've been in it, you never want to be out of it. My brother, the one that most of you guys have met, he grew up in Marble, part of a community. Then he joined the military and was part of the military for 8 years. Very much community oriented. He got out of the military in 2009 or 10. And between then and now, his life has just been topsy-turvy. He had community around him from 1991 at Marble until about 2010 when he got out of the military. And then once he got out of that community, he was searching for it, like subconsciously searching for it. My parents, during those 12, 13 years between when they left that community and found out at Marble, they were seeking after community. Between when I left Marble I left to go to college in 2003, my intention was still always to go back. That's how much of a draw it had on me. I got married in 2009 and moved to Spokane, and I never had that sense of community. I'm not blaming anyone other than me. I just didn't know how to get it. When I moved to Yakima, there was a part of me that was putting out that I wanted community. And I started to run into people, and I started to get to know people in Yakima. And I remember there was one particular day where this really was driven home to me. You guys all know I walk all over the place. So I was walking from my office over on 10th and Summit View I used to live like a couple blocks that way over on McLaren. And I was walking, and I was standing at the intersection of 16th and Tieton. And this car pulls up, rolls down to its window. I've only lived here for a couple of months. And someone waves out the window. I was like, what? I lived in Spokane for 8 years. I never ran into people. And I'm standing there on the corner waiting for my turn to walk, and another car drives by, honks, waves at me, and I'm like, I know that person too. About 3 cars later, honk, honk, roll down the window, wave out the window. I was like, hang on. I felt that sense of community again. And it was like that day, standing on that street corner, I felt that sense of community that I had been longing for. I knew that I was in the right place. Just standing there on that street corner, running into 3 people in a matter of 30 seconds out of a town of 100,000. I know it was God. He set all that stuff up for me. The concept of community is so powerful. During Vietnam War, like the soldiers in Vietnam, like 70% of them were addicted to heroin. It was between 65 and 70% were addicted to heroin. And everyone was freaking out because they were worried that these soldiers were going to come back from war and they were all going to be addicted to heroin. Well, the soldiers started coming back and started reintegrating with their families and into their communities again. And only like 3% actually remained addicted to heroin out of 70%. So the power of community was what those guys were missing. That's really what the heroin and the drugs were filling the place of community. And they came back, and heroin's still a terrible drug. Don't ever do it. Community is powerful. People who don't have it are jealous of it. People who have had it and now don't have it are constantly seeking it out. People who don't even know what it is. If you look at mental health crisis in this country, it's all a result of people not having connection. That's what drug addiction is really all about, is that people don't have connection. They don't have community on any level at all. So cherish what you have. Don't ever let it go. I'm glad I found this community. I'm glad I ran into Jared on that crosswalk. So next week, like I said, I wanted to lay out the idea of the power of community And next week, I have a very interesting practical thing that I want to bring up.